To continue our discussion of some of the most urgent threats to our national security, I'm now joined by Congressman Adam Smith from Washington, who chairs the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives. It's always great to talk to you, Congressman Smith. I think from the time we were in last time, we were talking about various kinds of threats that may face the nation in cyber, militarily, what our alliances were. Well, guess what? Right now, we're in the frying pan with a lot of this, and we're seeing where things really come together. And so I'd just like to ask you on the forefront of this, because I know you're probably getting practically hourly briefings on what's unfolding, both for allies in NATO, but with Russia's incursion and invasion of Ukraine. Let me just ask you, where are you heartened and where are you worried?
Yeah, I don't tend to think of the world in those terms. I can tell you where we are.
Okay.
My own personal mood notwithstanding. I think that in Ukraine, clearly the Russians have failed in their initial objective, and that's a positive thing. I think Putin definitely has outsized ambitions. If he had rolled into Ukraine the way he anticipated, knocking out the government in a few days and essentially annexing Ukraine, he'd be looking on to the next thing. To what he could do to further bring back the old Soviet Union. So certainly the capability of the Russian military and the entire Russian operation has proven to be far less than most people thought it was. Ukraine is putting up a fight. Obviously, the greatest tragedy is the humanitarian crisis going on in Ukraine. The price of stopping the Russians and the price of their invasion is overwhelming, and we see it every day. We need to get as much help as possible to Ukraine to help them win this fight, because the only way this ends is to make it clear to Putin that he cannot take Ukrainian territory by force, that he will be pushed back, and that Ukrainian will remain an independent, sovereign nation. We have to help them in that. I think the great overarching threat is that, Putin sort of went back 80 years in doing this invasion. And what does that mean for the globe? What does that mean for how China looks at Taiwan? What does that mean for anything that Russia would do in the future? It definitely heightens the necessity for an adequate deterrent to stop autocratic, violent nations like Russia and potentially China from acting. And how do we do that? How do we work with partners? It's a huge challenge. So certainly, the good news is that Russia is not as strong and powerful as they thought they were. The bad news is they've started a war, and where it leads is hard to predict and incredibly dangerous.
So, Mr. Chairman, one of the things that's very different in terms of the U.S. playbook in this is how we dealt with intelligence regarding what Putin's likely actions were, and that we declassified significant portions of that intelligence and put it out there. One of the problems, frankly, I've gone back to kind of go back and read in real time how the Europeans were looking at that. Much of the European leadership didn't believe our intelligence and thought we were trigger happy, thought we were basically not, in fact, telling the truth, and thought Putin wouldn't do it. I'd just be interested in your insights on this element and whether because I sort of applaud what happened on the intelligence front, but at the same time, I'm wondering if that's practicable in other cases and what it means for our allies in terms of intelligence sharing and revelation.
Well, in terms of that, it depends on the circumstances. In this case, I think clearly we had an interest in trying to expose what Putin was doing, because Putin hoped to do this the same way he did Crimea. Sneak in, put the facts on the ground, and then force people to accept them. So we wanted to make it clear up front what was going on to get people prepared. But I think the really interesting part about it is that cliche referred to as a failure of imagination. It's been so long. So much work has been done in Europe to create a peaceful continent, that what Putin did was unimaginable, because most of us have never lived to experience such a thing. And yes, European leadership, was blind to that aspect of the threat. And that's why I come back to what I said at the end of the answer to the last question. What does deterrence look like now? We were very worried about provoking Russia early on. Well, clearly provocation wasn't the issue. If they didn't feel deterred, they were willing to invade. So how do we build alliances? Certainly in Europe, but as your previous guests were saying as well, in Asia and beyond, to hopefully create an adequate deterrent so this type of violent takeover is not attempted by any country. I think that's really what what it tells us by the fact that the Europeans flat couldn't believe this. And I mean, the day before the invasion, I was talking to a senior government official who was on the phone with the ambassador and, was talking, okay, this is what's coming, be ready. And they were like, oh, you still think that? You guys are overhyping this. And then, 12 hours later, boom, it happened. So I think it's a wake up call for a lot of people.
Yeah, maybe next time around there'll be a different ability to absorb, I suppose. But I was very taken, Mr. Chairman, with an op-ed that you wrote in the Seattle Times, folks. It came out on March 25th. It's titled "The Russia Test for U.S.-China Relations." And in this, in a very focused way, you kind of go through these same questions of deterrence and helping to shape the choices for China based on what we're seeing today. And I'd love our audience to hear the three big pillars that you share of as you kind of look at China as not a foregone conclusion, but how can we shape the dimensions there so we don't end up with Ukraine in Asia?
Yeah, I think there are three big pieces to it. One is deterrence. If Putin had known for sure that he was in for the fight that he is now facing, it might likely have changed his calculation. And so, we can look at that lesson certainly in Eastern Europe. We need to shore up our Eastern European allies to make sure that they have an adequate defense. We can certainly look at it in Taiwan in supporting them and also with other allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, other nations that we work with. So a pure, straightforward military deterrence so that there's a high cost to a military attack is number one. Number two is alliances and partnerships. We cannot do this on our own. We cannot, deter China alone. We need as many partners as possible. Again, I will reference your previous guests talking about the Quad, our effort to work with India, Japan, and Australia as one example. We have other alliances in the region. We need partners. America first is not going to cut it. We need to make sure that we have the support of nations like Japan and South Korea and India and others as well, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand. How do we make sure that there's a mutual benefit, that they want to be partners with us, we want to be partners with them? And lastly, which may surprise some people, we also still have to maintain some sort of relationship with China. Look, the world is a much, much better place if we don't get into a direct conflict with China. And part of that is figuring out where we could potentially work together. I think arms control is a discussion that we ought to have. They're developing new weapon systems. We're developing new weapon systems. Ignorance can lead to miscalculation, can lead to conflict. Global warming is a challenge to all of us, the energy issues that we face. So while we're trying to build partnerships and be able to deter China, we also need to find places to say, hey, there is a possible future where we work together in a peaceful, more prosperous world. And we need to look for those diplomatic opportunities as well. I guess the other piece I would put in there is in helping our partners is development assistance. The U.S., at the end of World War II, we helped rebuild Europe. Europe turned into a prosperous place. We worked with Japan. We built a relationship with South Korea. These countries are now thriving capitalist democracies that are successful. If we look at those development opportunities across the globe to build support for liberal democracy as a good model to govern, we will have more allies and we'll have more support to deter aggression.
Chairman Smith, I'm going to ask you one more question before we take a question from the audience for you. But I was in Estonia recently at a national security conference, and what I learned there was a very big concern in that region, NATO allies, that NATO didn't have a playbook for dealing with some of the hybrid tools that Russia was developing, like weaponized migration, essentially trying to destabilize governments with migration. We're looking at the various dimensions of, cyber sabotage, et cetera. Lots of the areas, and so they worried that NATO didn't have a playbook in those areas. And I'm interested in just two quick things. Do you think we're preparing ourselves for the hybrid dimensions of conflict with nations that want to engage there? And secondly, if NATO turns out to be attacked by Russia, are we ready for that?
Yeah, and the first question, yes, but not fast enough. I was actually in Estonia just a month ago myself and was struck by some of those same things. Yeah, warfare has changed. I tell you, it was one of the biggest emphasis on my committee and something that Mike Rogers, the ranking Republican on the committee, and I are in lockstep on. We need to modify our approach, modernize our approach to warfare. Technology, it's all about information and survivability now. I mean, tanks are not as useful as they used to be. Drones are a lot more useful. Why do we have more tanks than drones? Just to put it in one dramatic place. And then, yes, the conflict will play out across a number of different lines, and we need to modify our force, and we need to integrate NATO into that. Now that Germany and some others are stepping up and spending more, how can we make sure that our collective force is maximally effective in this era? As far as being ready for a Russian attack, I think we're learning a lot. You've seen just in the last month a major surge in support from NATO, from the US into Eastern Europe to build up those defenses. But we got to be smart about how we build them up as well. We can't be fighting the last war. We can't be fighting the wars of the 20th century. We have to be looking at what information, what survivability means for how we need to modernize the Pentagon and our allies right now, today, and we've got to do it much faster. I'm very frustrated on a number of things. The Pentagon is not innovating as fast as they need to. We're going to keep putting pressure on them and try to get that done. I can take one question, and then votes have been called. I got to run across the street.
Thank you. We've got a question
from the audience. I can do that, and then I got to go.
Patricia Duff. Patricia?
Hi, I'm Patricia Duff, CEO of the Common Good, and I have two questions. First, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and Putin has truly upended the Western democracy's calculations for defense. So how will our defenses have to change as a result? My second question is that Ukraine needs to be able to defend against the missile strikes, or there will be little to defend in homes and infrastructure. The material we are sending there now is helping, but seems inadequate to save residences and cities. Is there anything more robust we can send before it's too late?
Yeah.
Take one.
Well, first of all, if you're the CEO of the Common Good, I would say you've got a lot of work to do. We need a lot more of that in the world today. As far as the question of what we need to get to them, air defenses are crucial. Being able to take down and defend against those missile strikes, to defend against, and also to defend against armor. So the Javelins and the Stingers are crucial. The surface-to-air missile systems are crucial. But above all else, to me, what is so crucial is drones. Because when you reference the destruction being rained down upon those cities, it's being rained down, some by standoff weapons, but primarily by artillery. The only way to effectively target artillery right now is through missiles, if we can get them adequate missiles, but drones. Drones have the ability to get out there and not be seen. They're survivable. They won't get shot down, and they can deliver a punch. So those are the systems that we have to get to them. Can we do it in time? That's hard. The Ukrainians are fighting bravely. They've pushed the Russians back. At the moment, we just have to get it to them as fast as we can. I think what the Ukrainians have proven is they can surprise us. So yes, I think we can get it to them in time to stop the Russians. Look, the destruction is already on a horrific scale. And we have to dedicate ourselves everywhere in the world to being prepared, to your first question, for how to stop that going forward. So we have to do that. Right now, we have to get what we can to the Ukrainians as fast as possible. I will say a lot of the weapon systems that we have gotten into them have proven quite effective. We've seen the Russians bogged down trying to take Kyiv. That's because their columns have been attacked. They've been attacked by drones. They've been attacked by those missiles. So we got to get more to them as fast as possible. And again, to answer your question, I do believe that the Ukrainians have the fight, and we have the ability to support them to be successful in stopping this Russian invasion. But understanding at this point that the horror is very real, and we have to rededicate ourselves to figuring out how to make sure things like this don't happen in the first place.
Well, House Armed Services Committee Chairman Adam Smith, read his op-ed, March 25th, Seattle Times. Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate it.